Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. Today on the program, senators want to probe the presence of Chinese military planes in the country.
China proclaims herself to be our friend. With friends like that, who needs enemies? This is nothing short of a naked display of power.
But the Foreign Affairs Department insists there's nothing fishy about it.
All of this dumaan sa proper channels, including the military. So normal ito.
Also, lawmakers hope to reconcile their version of the Bangsamoro Basic Law.
We've reached a consensus that whatever was in the armed law, Republic Act 9054, we will retain and hopefully enhance.
And will the Senate investigate the killings of local officials? And later, an underwater pod that could help in saving the boys trapped in a cave in Thailand. That's for today's In Focus. Thank you for joining us. Sitting in for Pinky Webb, I'm Ruth Cabal. Senators from the minority bloc filed a resolution seeking to probe the recent landings of Chinese military aircrafts in Davao City. Lawmakers question how the planes were able to get clearance when the Philippines has no international treaty with China. But the Foreign Affairs Department earlier clarified there is nothing irregular in the landings. Also, we get an update on the Bangsamoro Basic Law and the series of killings involving local government officials. Let's go straight to the source of the story. Senator Risa Hontiveros joins us via Viber. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Ms. Ruth, at sa lahat po ng mga tagapanood ng The Source.
Senator, yesterday the Senate minority bloc, including you, of course, filed a resolution calling for an investigation on the landings of these Chinese military aircrafts. There was one on June 8, then another on June 24. But some, like Senator Antonio Trillanes, is saying hindi lang ito yung mga paglanding siya ng Chinese aircrafts. Why do you want to investigate this?
Well, just as Senator Sonny said, and led by Senator Leila, we did file that minority resolution because, as you mentioned earlier also, Ms. Ruth, we don't have an agreement regulating the visit or landing, let alone landing, of foreign or Chinese military aircraft. And there was irregularity, apparently, in those reported landings because at the outset, even the armed forces of the Philippines said they didn't know about it. So they were not the ones who knew of it or authorized it. There was a statement from Malacanang that an office of theirs received, processed, and cleared the landing. Pero hindi malinaw na dumaan ito sa anumang existing agreement between the Philippines and China. And most worryingly, mismong yung ating defense and military establishment ay hindi alam ito at wala silang kinalaman sa paglapag nito. I mean, we want to find out, is the President's mere say-so that such foreign military aircraft can land enough to allow this, lalo na, Ms. Ruth, given our constitutional prohibition against the use of our country by foreign military bases, personnel, and equipment or craft such as this Chinese military plane.
Okay, ma'am, when you say na wala po kasi tayong treaty with China, di ba ang sinasabi, we have one with the US, with Australia. Pero I was reading the report of the AFP, they were saying na 70 aircrafts nga daw landed in different airports, as well as 25 vessels from foreign countries visited the Philippines daw. Tapos may permission daw ito, especially, well, isa sa binanggit nila when we hosted the ASEAN Summit last year, no? So, ano po ba talaga ang pamantayan pag ganito?
Sorry, Ms. Ruth, but a great part of your question was very choppy on my audio, but I did catch part of it. And ang pagkakaiba po nitong paglapag ng Chinese military plane, not just once, possibly not just twice, possibly more often, as Senator Sonny Trillanes has said, pagkakaiba nito sa paglapag at pagdaong ng ibang mga eroplano o barko kamakailan lamang ay apparently our country has agreements governing the visit of those other countries' military craft to our country. We don't have a single agreement with China governing the reported landings of that or of those Chinese military planes at the Davao City International Airport. And we know, Ms. Ruth, no, sa usapin ng foreign policy, those official documents between two countries and two peoples are very important to set the tone of our foreign policy, to send clear messages or signals to the public kung ano ba ang foreign policy and strategy natin. Lalo na in this particular case, with that particular nation, China, who was the subject of our victorious case at the arbitral tribunal at The Hague on the West Philippine Sea, but which is now China, which is now heavily militarizing not just the West Philippine Sea but the whole South China Sea, and which is also going to be allegedly the source of a lot of incoming loans into our economy, loans which terms we also need to be aware of completely the details of, so that we aren't caught in a new kind of debt trap diplomacy by China towards developing nations such as ours.
Senator, you mentioned the Hague ruling. We'll go back to that later. Pero balikan lang po natin kasi even the Department of Foreign Affairs is saying na itong landing ng Chinese military planes have clearance. It followed protocols. Let's listen first to the statement of Foreign Affairs Secretary Cayetano.
All of this dumaan sa proper channels, including the military. So normal ito. It's may proseso, meron tayong permits.
Senator, ano po masasabi niyo dyan sa statement ng DFA?
Well, definitely, Ms. Ruth, dapat may tamang proseso. But unfortunately, the infrastructure for that process isn't even set up yet. We don't have an agreement between the Philippines and China allowing and governing the landing of such Chinese military craft in any of our airports. There aren't the identified agencies which are in charge of running and managing that process. Regardless of what the good secretary said at the outset, the armed forces itself said they didn't know about the landing of the Chinese military plane at the Davao City International Airport. At sa ganyang mga usapin, dapat naman siguro yung defense at military officials natin ang pinaka nakakaalam at nangangasiwas sa ganyang mga gawain. It was only an office in the a unit of the Office of the President which said that they received, processed and cleared the landing of that plane, but that can't be enough. It's not just civilian offices of government that must manage or regulate such landings, and that very process has to be designed and enshrined or embedded in an agreement. There is no agreement, and the good secretary knows that.
Senator, I will just mention a part of your resolution kasi sinabi niyo po dyan na this is giving rise to speculations that the use by the Chinese military of Davao City's airport facilities is a personal favor granted by the President to China. What do you mean by personal favor, ma'am?
Well, in the context, Ms. Ruth, of governments or the administration's opaqueness about its foreign policy with China, its unwillingness until now to file formal diplomatic protests, not even a note verbal to China or before the United Nations about Chinese harassment of Filipino fisherfolk, its militarization even of our exclusive economic zone, our part of the South China Sea, which is the West Philippine Sea, yung pagsira nila sa mga bahura natin, giant clams and other important and endangered marine species, gives rise to the suspicion that there isn't any serious effort to enshrine our foreign policy and foreign policy strategies vis-a-vis that very important nation, China, in our region. But instead, idinadaan lahat sa personalan. Imagine for a foreign military plane not governed by any executive agreement with that plane's country to be allowed to land at one of our important airports without the knowledge of the most important stakeholders who should be identified by such an agreement and should be in charge of such landings, specifically the DND and the AFP. And then just for a unit of the Office of the President to say that they were the ones, or he was the one, this alter ego of the President was the one who cleared the landing of the plane. That's highly irregular and is not the action of a responsible administration taking seriously its foreign policy responsibilities. Oo, ang Pangulo nga yung chief architect ng foreign policy at ang bawat salita niya, whether about foreign or domestic policy, precisely takes on the nature of policy. He most of all should know that we need agreements between our country and others, and we need the stakeholders on our side of the agreements to be properly identified, mandated, and respected to carry out their mandates. Hindi pwedeng parang personal na pakiusap lang or idadaan sa ibang channels, pati civilian channels, ang ganyang usapin na foreign military plane ang nakasalang.
Okay, ma'am, would you know yung status nito? Has this been referred to the committee or kailan niyo po planong mag-conduct ng hearings?
Actually, Ms. Ruth, this was just the latest in a series of resolutions being filed regarding foreign policy incidents between the Philippines and China. Simula pa nung taong 2016. Mula noon, nag-file si Senator Bam, so nag-file din sina Senator Leila and Senator Sonny Trillanes. I also filed a resolution at nitong huli, nanguna nga ulit si Senator Leila sa amin sa minority para mag-file kami nitong latest resolution. Yesterday, my office also organized Kasarinlan, a foreign policy forum, at para i-reiterate din yung pangangailangan ng isang foreign policy audit ng ating gobyerno, lalo na kaugnay ng bansang China. And this was timed, Ms. Ruth, because on Thursday, July 12th, we will be commemorating the second anniversary of our historic victory. In that case, we filed before the arbitral tribunal at The Hague. And I'm very glad na kamakailan lamang both Senators Lauren and Greg Onasan, respectively chairs of the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations and National Defense, expressed their willingness publicly to finally hear our resolutions. Hiling din po namin yan sa minority sa pamamagitan ni Minority Leader Frank Drilon na ipakiusap lalo na kay Senate President Tito na idinig na po sana namin sa Senado itong mga resolusyon dahil these are very timely with the upcoming second anniversary of the Hague ruling, and because hindi talaga humuhupa yung aggressive actions ng China sa West Philippine Sea, pati sa ating exclusive economic zones, and there has not yet been a clear, sustained, and strong response from our government. Sabi po ni Secretary Cayetano, 50 to 100 diplomatic protests na daw ang nagawa nila. What are these? At ano yung mga results that these have actually generated?
Okay, ma'am, we'll talk more about the Hague ruling. Sinasabi niyo nga kasi 2 years na po yan, ano. But we'll talk more about that. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Still to come, will the Senate also launch a probe on the killings of local officials? Senator Risa Hontiveros will still be with us after the break. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guest today is Senator Risa Hontiveros. And Senator, you were mentioning that it's been 2 years since The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines over the maritime dispute in South China Sea. But many of our local fishermen there are still complaining about reports of alleged harassment by the Chinese Coast Guard. Let's go back to what they have to say.
Tingnan na nila yung mga lagayan namin. Yun, pipiliin nila yung magagandang isda. Wala naman kami magagawa kasi kumbaga sa nakikisama lang muna kami diyan ngayon dahil andyan yung mga barko nilang malalaki. Anong magagawa naming mangingisda doon kung magtitigas-tigasin kami doon? Para lang kaming doon yung lata na pinitpit. Pag magtitigas-tigasan siguro kami doon. Kumbaga pasensya na lang. Pero hindi naman totally na na aalis din sila na walang kapalit. Minsan nagbibigay sila ng noodles, sigarilyo, saka tubig.
Senator, yan na nga po, no? Narinig natin yung kwento ng mga mangingisda dyan. But we have this Hague ruling in favor of the Philippines. Do you think the government is doing enough to enforce that? Or should the Senate demand for an apology from China because of those instances?
I think in the hearings that we'll be conducting, the Senate, certainly we in the minority, will be why hasn't government filed formal complaints against China? Malinaw naman na doon sa common fishing grounds of the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, even while disputes about conflicting claims are still being resolved. Part of that dispute has been settled by the arbitral ruling. At yung iba ay at least sinasabi common fishing grounds yan. Our Philippine Coast Guard is not preventing Chinese or Vietnamese fishers from using the common fishing grounds. Bakit pinipigilan ng Chinese Coast Guard yung mga maliliit na mangingisda natin makapangisda, makapaghanap buhay doon? Why are armed Chinese Coast Guards boarding Philippine small fishing craft and forcibly taking their catch? Nagbo-board sila armado. Pinipili nila at kinukuha yung pinakamagandang huli ng mga mangingisda natin. Di umano, binibigyan nila ng noodles, ano ba yon, sigarilyo at saka tubig. But is that proper trade relations between the peoples of two countries? Sa pilitang binoboard, armado pa yung kabila, tapos kinukuha yung huli ng walang paumanhin. And why have we not filed formal complaints? Those are violations of the rights of our small fisher folk. Dagdag pa, in other areas of the West Philippine Sea, China has continued to militarize our parts of our territory. There, sinisira nila yung mga natural resources natin. So where are the clear diplomatic protests and other actions by our Foreign Affairs Department? Kaya naghain kami ng resolution on the part of the minority precisely because the actions of the executive have been sorely lacking and in fact almost completely absent.
Senator, balikan ko lang, no? Kasi dun sa statements din itong mga mangingisda, may nagsabi din sa kanila na parang mas okay daw yung sitwasyon ngayon kasi mas nakakalapit sila, hindi daw under the Aquino administration na binobomba sila ng mga Chinese Coast Guard at hindi man lang makalapit doon sa fishing grounds.
Well, I think, Ms. Ruth, with all due respect sa ating mga kababaeng mangingisda na nandun sa Malacanang Presscon, alam naman tayo mga Pilipino, grasyoso, ang hirap naman na dinala sila dun sa Malacanang, yung pinaka-official residence ng ating bansa, hinost sila ng presidential spokesman, at halos siya yung nagpapadaloy ng presscon nila. Medyo mahirap naman sila magsabi ng sama ng loob, di ba? Or magreklamo. I think they were placed, it was unfair of Malacanang to place them in that situation. It was a power play. Ang hirap namang ay mga mangingisda ay kontrahin yung sinasabi ng alter ego ng presidente dun mismo sa official resident ng presidente. I think just as much as that press con set up by the presidential spokesman, we should look at the actual videos of the fishermen being boarded in their small fishing craft by those armed Chinese Coast Guard who took their catch without their permission, without their invitation to so-called barter trade with them and exchange their precious catch for consumer items. So these are the things that we will be examining in the Senate inquiry bilang isa sa maraming piraso ng parang puzzle na lang, Ms. Ruth, parang isang misteryo kung ano na ba talaga ang kabuang polisiya ng ating gobyerno sa bansang China. What is our foreign policy strategy in dealing with this regional power, this emerging global power. At para malamanan na rin natin once and for all, yung sinasabi ni Presidente from the start na he would champion daw an independent foreign policy. What exactly does that mean? Because it has not been given flesh and face and voice to until now. Most glaringly in this case of inaction, opaqueness, and seeming docility in the face of Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea.
Senators, should China apologize or would the Senate demand an apology from China?
I'm sorry, Ms. Ruth, I missed that.
Do you think China should apologize or will the Senate demand an apology from China?
It would be great, Ms. Ruth, if China would apologize. I can't imagine how that might happen, but that would be a wonderful miracle. But the Senate will continue to do our duty to exercise oversight on what should be a clearly articulated foreign policy of the government. In the meantime, habang tinutuloy pa rin ng China yung ganitong mga aksyon and no apology or corrective action on their part is forthcoming. In fact, as Acting Chief Justice Antonio Carpio has said repeatedly, and he was our keynote speaker at the Kasarinlangan Foreign Policy Forum yesterday, our country could actually file a complaint even even at the Hague Tribunal and in other international fora to push for the code of conduct in the South China Sea, to push for agreements on our conduct with Philippines, China, and Vietnam in the common fishing grounds. So there's a lot of room for diplomacy. Hindi ang pagpipilian lamang tulad ng sinasabi ng gobyerno ay pananahimik lamang, pagiging kimik lamang, o manggera. Nobody is calling for war on our part. And I don't think, some of our resource persons yesterday very sharply said it wouldn't be that easy for China to go to war either. At siguradong on our side, the Philippines, ang sinasabi nating laban, pushback, is diplomatic and political. And we have the most powerful weapon so far. Ms. Ruth, our speakers yesterday were emphatic that our victory at The Hague is the most important legal decision so far under the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It dramatically increased what is called the global commons in the oceans by saying itong mga karagatang ito are a common patrimony of all humankind, of all peoples, especially as far as the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea is concerned here in our region. It is the common patrimony, common fishing ground, common energy source of many member nations to the UNCLOS and many residents and claimants here in the West Philippine Sea and in the South China Sea. So, ang laki ng espasyo dapat for cooperative, at the same time assertive, in each of our national interests, and peaceful coexistence in the region based on the rule of law. Unang-una na ang UNCLOS and ang kani-kanyang konstitusyon.
Senator, briefly lang, no, medyo cause of concern kasi the killing of local officials. Would you want to investigate this? Will the Senate investigate this? Some of your party mates are saying this is creating an environment of lawless violence, possibly for the declaration of martial law nationwide.
Yes, Ms. Ruth, we in Akabayan and we are coalition partners with the Liberal Party, with the Magda Law Party, and I believe majority senators also would share our concern that these attacks against now local government officials on the heels of thousands of suspected small-time drug users, on the heels of the killings of 3 Catholic priests and an attack on a 4th, are part and parcel of an atmosphere, an environment of violence and impunity, which unfortunately has been largely engendered by the violent statements of the president, promises of violence on his part, threats to kill members of different sectors of society. Mga atake talaga ito sa demokrasya, Ms. Ruth, particularly in the case of the killings of local government officials. We could ask if even they are not safe, all the more hindi ligtas ang mga ordinaryong mamamayan. Those are signs of a breakdown in proper ensuring of public safety, law enforcement, and scarily, some sectors are starting to express the apprehension that, especially with the unbelievable, preposterous accusation of Malacanang that these killings of the local government officials are a setup to discredit the president. Oh my God, parang throwback, hindi pa pala Thursday ngayon, no? Tuesday pa lamang, pero throwback to the martial law playbook of the former dictator Marcos in the 1970s. Bagamat mas mahigpit na ngayon ang ating 1987 Constitution that only rebellion and invasion may constitute grounds for the declaration of martial law, pero sa pinapakitang gawi ng administrasyon, what is to stop them from painting these attacks, these very suspicious killings of local government officials as part of a so-called rebellion? Inaakusa nila sa oposisyon at para bigyan ng excuse magdeklara ng martial law. So this violence is a very disturbing occurrence in itself, as an attack on human beings, citizens, local officials. At they serve to more and more of us as warning signs of a creeping, manipulation of events to fit a certain narrative, to fit a certain trajectory. So all the more, Ms. Ruth, dapat maging alisto tayo, kalma, pero tuloy-tuloy na nag-aanalisa. And we must engage government from different sectors, civil society, even the private sector, to arrest this decline in, I would say, the quality of life and the quality of our democracy. It's an aside, but with reference to the private sector, for example, the recent presentation of UP School of Economics Professor Emmanuel de Dios, the insulted economy. Very, very interesting that despite sound fundamentals from the previous years, there's really a strain on our economy emanating from the political side of our national situation, the unbridled power, the uninhibited use of power with less and less checks and balances, deliberately weakened separate and co-equal branches of government, this unbridled exercise of power by the executive.
Senator, you just mentioned the throwback to the martial law playbook. So are you really looking at the possibility of, nationwide martial law?
Well, nobody wanted to, but the president keeps on, from time to time, wondering aloud about it. So I refuse to accept yung sinasabi nila na not to take him seriously or to take him with a grain of salt. For God's sake, he's our president. We should be able to believe what our highest elected public official is saying, na yun talaga ang iniisip niya or damdamin niya, yun talaga ang sinasabi niya. And as I mentioned earlier, every word from the mouth of the president assumes the nature of policy. So if he keeps from time to time wondering aloud about martial law, we should pay attention. And kailangan magsalita, kailangan kumilos tayo, bearing out, for example, what the surveys in previous quarters have shown, that the majority of respondents, the majority of Filipinos, believe that martial law is not the solution to our problems. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that, Ms. Ruth. It's not martial law or so-called revolutionary government that is the solution to our problems. It is using our democratic muscles, democratic institutions and mechanisms to strengthen our democracy, our economy as well, as a country.
Okay, thank you very much to Senator Risa Hontiveros, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ruth.
Thank you for joining us here on The Source. I'm Ruth Cabal. You're watching CNN Philippines.